What percentage of people that you hang out with in your normal life are conservative? Just by a raise of hands, is it 20% for you guys, if you think? There's some. Okay. 10%? 5%? Oh my God. 1%? Okay, so, all right, well, we polarize like this, obviously, already as individuals, even us liberals. And obviously conservatives aren't any different because they're interacting in the same way with their people. We're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about why we polarize. We're going to talk about why conservatives think we're polarizing and why they're mostly okay with it. And at the end of it, we're going to talk about what to do about polarization, okay? At the very beginning of this country, we had one major reason why polarization got set up, and that was primary elections, okay? Primary elections are a way to decide by party who's going to actually go into the general election. And when you have a party with a bunch of specialized people that are trying to get a specialized interest done, competing with another one right off the bat for specialized people, then when they come together, one of them is going to be a loser. We have a structural method for polarization, and we've had that for a couple of 100 years now. Obviously, that's not going to change. But that's not the reason why polarization is happening so much today. There are other reasons why we've actually had changes occur. We're going to talk about one of those now, and that is the South. The Democrats in the South migrated over to the Republican Party over a period of about 70 years, so that now all the conservatives and all the liberals are in two separate parties. And that's really a first. It's always been kind of combined, and in the old days, in the Democratic Party, it was a real pain to try and get a party platform. And now it's relatively easy because all the conservatives have ejected themselves. During the 30s and 40s and 50s, every once in a while, the Southerners would be upset with the other Democrats about things like state rights and religious type things. And so they would do these cross-party alliances with the Republicans. And now there's no reasons to do cross-party alliances. So that's why we have this second split. As a result of this split now between conservatives and liberals, we have this actual highly competitive environment that's really formed between the two parties. And for some reason, we're actually rather equal in how things work in this society. So it's been unusual for the last 30, 40 years to have a situation where the president and the Senate and the legislature were all the same. Like all the way through Franklin Roosevelt's time, for instance, they were all the same. And so you had this kind of big swing to the left. And in the 50s, we had a big swing to the right. And those kinds of things have been really fairly normal. But now, over the last 30 years, I think we've had 4 years where we actually had all three of those things together. And that means that we're really competitive. And if you think about it, just having crosstown rivals, that football teams or whatever, you know, you're going to have an intensity about things that way. Does that make sense? It's just really natural for us to do that. So in the environment now where we have this sort of equality in terms of overall power, where one group, the Democrats and the liberals, tend to have more people, but the Republicans, the conservatives, tend to have more power because of money and for other reasons. And so they do tend to balance out in this way. But that competitive situation is really something to think about. It's new in the sense that it's never been going on this long. So now we're getting really good at being competitive. And one of the things you see about competition like this is that it's not acceptable to take the other guy's good ideas and run with them, right? Because if you do that, then you end up in a situation where you're making them look good, right? So you've got to just kind of be against everything that these other people do. So as you look at this graph here, you can see that we've got a situation where polarization has just gone straight up, and this is looking at congressional polarization, so it's not really looking at us people out here. but it does give you an indication that historically we're more polarized than we ever have been. We had a big period in the industrial age, and if you look back in history, that kind of makes sense what was going on during that time. But now we're way beyond that. And that's this, a lot of that is this competition that we're talking about. Another migration that most people don't know about that's really important is called the Big Sort by a researcher called Bill Bishop, who won a Pulitzer Prize over this. And what's happened is that when people move now, with our modern society since 1975, we've been moving a lot because jobs are elsewhere now and jobs shift, right? There's a lot of mobilization in our society for the first time ever. We move to where other people in our ideology live. That's why Bill called it the Big Sort. And this gets back at a point that I talk about a lot, which is that ideology is super fundamental to ourselves. It actually, in scientific, statistical terms, it's as fundamental to us as our personality. It's not part of our personality. It's actually something that's separate, but it determines where we live. It determines who we interact with. It determines the fact that you guys are hanging out with 10% of the people that are, you know, there's 40% of them in America, and you guys hang out with 10, or it looked like 10 or 5% on average. And there's a reason for that. It's very fundamental to our natures. Well, now we're actually physically separating in this way. And you can see this at state level, you can see it at counties, you can see it at cities, and you can see it in individual areas, and even by block you can see it. We're moving towards each other in this really dramatic fashion. That's not very intuitive, but if you think about it, it means a lot in terms of polarization, because now we're physically separating from each other. That's why you guys only see 5 or 10% of conservatives in your daily lives out here in California, because you've physically separated yourself from them. One thing that you probably know about, you probably complain about a lot about in terms of polarization, why we have it, is because we have two news channels now, right? We have conservative sources of news and we have liberal sources of news. And that's also brand new. It came out as a result of Fox News, but also CNBC started to drift leftward, in my opinion. And now we have this situation where people don't get the same news. They don't find out the same things. If they do find out about the same facts, the way that they're told about are so different. I watch a lot of news, conservative news, as a result of doing this work with Reach the Right. And sometimes I'll be watching it for 30 seconds before I even find out what it's about, because I had heard the same thing on a liberal channel and it just been spoken about completely differently. So that's obviously one important way that we're polarizing. And one really important fact about that is that when our news is driven by this capitalistic desire for profit, we end up with gossipy components to it because of our nature. We like gossip. So we don't hear, the equivalent of Walter Cronkite today doesn't say, "Well, come right back after the station break and we'll tell you all about something that the conservatives did that was really great." Instead, it's, come right back and we'll show you how, we'll show you a conservative with his pants down. That's the way that the news works now. It's gossipy, but it gets us looking at it, and it plays to our biases and creates a lot of extra polarization that way. So a sixth reason is income inequality. And we don't really need to go into a lot of detail about it because it's a pretty controversial subject, and it also is hard to figure out why income inequality is happening. But from a polarization standpoint, it's really simple, because basically people that don't make a lot of money vote Democrat, and they tend to be liberal. And people that make more money generally vote conservative. And so as the society is doing this, so we have a smaller middle class, a larger lower class, and a very small elite a group of people that are making a lot more money, you just tend to get this natural polarization. And then, of course, through the polarization process, we elect people who tend to sort of work for, work for those who make more money or those who make less money, and so you get even more polarization that way. It's just inevitable. because of our voting structure. Now, I want to talk finally about the main reason why, in my opinion, we're actually polarized. And it's the only reason that conservatives ever talk about. But I think it's really important for us to realize too. Because what liberals don't seem to understand a lot of times when I talk to them about this is that most of the time, many conservatives, not necessarily centrist types of conservatives or really moderate, but certainly sort of hard right and to a certain degree some moderate conservatives, have no problem whatsoever with polarization. Now, why is that? Why would they have that perspective when many, many liberals are really, really upset about it? Well, this has to do with the changes in society that have occurred over the last 40 years. Okay, we don't really think about it as liberals, but these changes have had an enormous impact on our lives. And most of us here are fairly young and we didn't really experience a lot of these changes, but let's just kind of go through some of the things that have occurred, let's say in the last 50 years, okay? We had to retreat out of Vietnam, all right? Since then, we've retreated out of Iraq. We've retreated out of Afghanistan, okay? We're not the same country that we were in the sense that the American dream has been really threatened. We were talking about the mobilization of society earlier. Well, one of the reasons why we're so mobile now is because of globalization, which really began in the 70s, has taken jobs and systematically moved them all over the world. And the jobs that are left here are not as steady. And now, for the very first time in the generation today, we have good statistical evidence that people will not be as successful as their parents. Well, from a conservative standpoint, that is not cool at all, right? Because this is the greatest country in the world, and we're starting to kind of look like, boy, you know? And that's really frustrating, and they feel like they see reasons for it. But you know what? The real reason why doesn't have to do with that. It's other things too. Religion has gone down, steadily declined during these last 40 years. So our attitudes about sex, our attitudes about marriage, whatever the heck a family is constituted out of, abortion, those things have all changed. We created welfare. We created this Consumer Protection Bureau. Are you starting to see a theme here? These are things that liberals are cool with, okay, for the most part. And conservatives really have a tough time with them because these are changes that are happening. Now conservatism is okay with change, okay? In fact, it's built in to a lot of the things that they talk about. Russell Clark has something called a common popular manifesto for conservatism called 10 Points of Conservatism. And in there, they talk about change as being healthy, as long as it's controlled, right? So the key word is control. Can they control these things? They can't. You know, the Clean Air Act is in place now. Marijuana is suddenly something that we seem to be sort of considering to be okay. Big business regulation is something that's becoming a lot more familiar to us now, and we're taking a lot more steps in that direction than we used to. See, if you look at that list, okay, there's nothing in there that's cool from a conservative standpoint. They have won a few things. You know, they've been able to take a little bit of tax increases here and there that helped them from their standpoint. There were some budget things that they won. But then even that, the money stuff, there's this massive deficit going on, which is totally unprecedented, which we seem sort of okay with, but conservatives are not okay with at all. And so there's these people that are standing back and just going, look, this is enough. This is ridiculous. You think polarization is a problem? Try a huge crisis where we're just going to, you know, implode socially, right? They're afraid. That's what polarization is it's a large group of people that are really afraid about massive amounts of uncontrollable change. So I'm trying to explain them. I hope you're not getting a sense that I really believe these things, but I do want you to understand from their standpoint why it is so difficult for them. So what is it that we can do about these things? You know, what should we do as liberals about polarization? Well, you know, from a Reach the Right standpoint, I make a case in general for the opposite of polarization. I mean, that's what this position is all about, is really, it's my contention that as liberals we do a really bad job of reaching out to centrists and to moderate conservatives, to people that actually share a lot of our values, but they also share values that conservatives have, and we don't have good prepared talking points toward them. And we don't, the talking points that we do have sound hollow because we don't really understand them very well. Research shows that liberals don't understand conservatives as well as conservatives understand liberals. And that seems shocking to a lot of liberals that I meet, but it's not really. In my experience, I've been out there talking with liberals and conservatives a lot, and this is really true. They do understand us much better on the street. I've seen it many times. And so we need to make a little bit of better effort to understand centrists and moderate conservatives so that we can reach them from a policy standpoint. But that's, you know, there's a lot of things in terms of strategy with how to handle, you know, doing well with conservatives. There's all kinds of things. Sometimes you should polarize. Sometimes you should be really aggressive. Sometimes you should be really nice. Sometimes you should totally agree with them and do things with them. There's a plethora, a sort of matrix of things that you should do. But let's talk about us as individuals. Let's get down on the floor, okay? You and I, we interact with our uncle. We interact with people at work. We interact with our local representatives, our city council, our regional representatives, people that are in charge of us at work, say. Okay, these are the conservatives that we interact with. What does polarization have to do with them? Okay? If you look at those things that we talked about, there's really nothing there that has to do with these individuals. Okay? Polarization, from the standpoint of the media that we're talking about, where we hear these things, there's all this messaging going on that is polarization. These are put out by people who are statistically much more polarized than the average conservative. Okay, the pundits and the politicians themselves. Okay, if you get sucked into the notion of polarization so that you're really bought off on it and being real bitter and getting in the habit of dealing with polarization that way in a sort of tit-for-tat fashion, you're basically borrowing from a playbook, from a script, from somebody that's really desperate. And you don't need to play that playbook. You know, in a lot of ways, and it's a big subject, but the future is, just like the past had a lot of liberal wins in it, the future is also going to be that way. And we need to play that way. We need to play as if we were gracious winners, which is really what's going on. And, you know, at the beginning of conversations a lot of times with conservatives, they are bought into a lot of polarization, so it's really tough to avoid it, actually. It's not simple to take this advice of mine and just ignore it. But, you know, you need to be a little bit like Keanu Reeves, you know, in The Matrix, when these bullets come at the beginning, you just kind of, you know, right? I mean, you have to get out of the way from the insults that happen, particularly at the very beginning, when there's all this ire because they're afraid, right? And they're trying to get across how important it is to take care of these things because America's future is at stake. And then after you get over that, my experience is after just a couple of minutes of talking, things can tone down. When they understand that you're actually listening to them and that you respect and in some ways you agree with some of the things that they feel, that moment, things change in the conversation. And that's what I'm hoping for people. I'm hoping that they can understand that the conservative mind is actually got some real rationality behind it. They've got real things to say that are important. And they may not feel what they don't feel what we do, but they do have things that we can consider and that we can listen to and we can relate to them and try and sit with them and understand them, to respect them, to be curious. Those are the things that I hope for liberals. Okay, so let's take some Q&A here. Let's take some questions. Go ahead, sir.
On the topic of income inequality, you were saying that Republicans tend to be more affluent and supporting tax policies. But what about the rural guy in a pickup truck in Kansas or Alabama who doesn't make that much money and he's voting for policies that support Mitt Romney and the 1%? Sure.
That's a big subject. I don't want to get into all of it, but in the context of polarization, what we really just need to remember is that we're talking about a sort of statistical fact. So there are lots of poor Republicans that vote Republican, and will keep voting Republican no matter how much inequality happens. All I'm saying is that I was trying to keep the income inequality portion of polarization simple, and just saying that it's just a simple fact that statistically speaking, as we get this separation, we get hardcore conservatives and hardcore liberals happening, and so we just get more polarization.
Related to that, though, the thing that I don't understand is why does somebody like the guy in the pickup truck vote for politicians that are putting in policies that are not in his interest?
Sure. We often vote for things that are not in our personal interest. It's a good thing about us that we try to chase things based on our ideals. And so a lot of conservative people are voting for things that are not in their interest. And you know what? I vote for a lot of things that aren't in my interest either. I do it all the time because it's going to benefit somebody else. I tend to vote for higher taxes, for instance. I'm not happy about it, but I want higher taxes. That's exactly what's going on with them for the most part. Anybody else? Yes.
Is it always necessary to be polite to conservatives?
Well, no. Thanks for asking that. It's just as I tried to allude to earlier. From a policy standpoint, there's all kinds of different things that people should do along the sort of emotional spectrum in terms of getting a good candidate elected, getting good policies to happen. With an individual conservative, you need to just think of it in terms of being with an individual, any individual. Part of the whole point is that what happens for some reason with liberals is that we sort of treat everybody okay, but then when we get to conservatives, there's a sort of bump in the road, and we panic. And that has to do with something we go over in the psychology and the neurology talk, which is really there's a sort of personality conflict there. So sometimes you can't get over the personality conflict. But the key there is not to be rude, it's to be absent, right? That's the time to go take a body break. Get out of the way, you know, and just and learn to live with whatever distance it is that you can handle with that individual, just as if you had any personality conflict with anyone else. Does that make sense? Yeah. Thanks.